Hello there, and welcome to Weird Music on the Glumberger channel, the strange music show taking looks into, unusual albums, right? So, long-time viewers of this show will no doubt know of my interest in drone music, right? So, the story for this album goes, maybe 7 or so years ago, I want to say, I was browsing discogs for more ambient drone albums. Searching the shops by genre came up with a bunch of interesting releases that I'd never heard before. Great way to check out music that, by the way. So I cycled through some cheaply sold ones at the time, purchased a couple, many of which are still in my collection to this day. And this is one such album, right? A 2-track album of drone music that seems to have come from absolutely nowhere, it feels. Just out of thin air itself. I remember, I have heard this a bunch of times prior to this review, but when I was sitting down to write this, my thoughts about the music for the first time, I just had no memory of how all of this occurred, to be honest. For an album that seemed like somebody was trying to get rid of on Discogs, this is a very cool thing, to own in my collection, and something that really sent my brain down these weird rabbit holes and just trying to articulate that into this very experience for you today. Definitely in among, the weirdest of drone albums, right? But let's get on with it. So today, I present Set by Exit. Right, so not a great deal I can actually say about this album. I mean, who is Exit? What is Set? Well, it is what it is. This thing right here. This particular physical CD release. So from what I've found out, Exit is an alias for one Charles Holmes. Who is Charles Holmes? I don't know. Couldn't really find out much about the dude. All I know is they make music under the moniker of Exit, or did once or twice. But not a lot else. So then, what is Set? Well, Set, this is what I believe to be the second album released under the moniker of Exit, following a self-titled release back in 1996. So this released in 97 on the record label I, which seems to be a specific subset of the record label Che, which specializes in alternative and left-field releases. Don't know much about either of these labels, not ones I've ever thought to go and check out, but following diving into this album, I think I should try find the time at some point, right? So in regards to this album, there's not really a lot to go on, really. Discogs tells us that the composer Charles Holmes is credited, or not credited as it actually says, as performing guitar for this album. And on the CD, we know a little bit more as it tells us that this set, pun intended, was recorded live at the studio Brixton and was engineered by one Ian MacKaye, not to be confused with the actual Ian MacKaye from Fugazi, of course. But besides this, we have very little to go on though. Just a weird sort of live performance of singular guitar tones and drones that results in a very weird synthetic sounding music. To be fair, I think we should expect this kind of thing, right? Looking at the crazy sounds that come from the likes of Lou Reed on Metal Machine Music, or the persistent long-end drone of the Grogerige Not Friendly, an album we have looked at previously, or even Let the Power Fall by Robert Fripp, an album we'll be looking at some point. All of these albums, in particular listening to Let the Power Fall in preparation for its video, which will be coming out at some point this year, it really helped me understand a little bit about more what I thought was going on here, if that makes sense. Maybe, I don't actually know. This one really confused me, to be fair. But to be fair, all of these mentioned albums all performed on guitars that sound like synthesized music instead. The result of unusual experimentation, producing incredibly dense, thick layers of drone that stun and hypnotize in their own weird, resonating ways. And this album was very cool to try and listen to, even if it resulted in what I think will be a largely incomprehensible video for the most part. But regardless, I wanted to try talk about it, so let's see what the hell's going on here, shall we? So, set by exit, opening up with am nil. We have an introduction of sustained notes, gently oscillating rather slowly it feels, accompanied by the faintest frequencies before a sudden density of those low-end guitar notes suddenly fall into the scene. A myriad of tones all repeating and looping over and over one another with this very peculiar echoing effect of delay it feels. It becomes a very immediately hypnotizing set, where the guitar just seems to abstractly glide from note to note, producing very elongated notes that then repeat over and over and over one another, adding to the strangeness of the whole thing, before it just envelops you in the density of drone music itself. Like, I was very oddly enough reminded of the kind of effects that occur when, Robert Fripp performs Frippatronics here. The way that his particular techniques interprets guitar playing in such a very synthetic way of it essentially performing guitar loops that travel over in tape loops, and so it echoes and echoes and you have more on top of it. I had a similar vibe here, but to be fair, when it comes to this, I have no idea what's actually being done here. But it's interesting though. The way the delay effects here have that kind of natural fading effect, after a couple of iterations, it creates a kind of improvised composition that feels like it's always evolving and morphing the more it all occurs. And it's very unusual, but there is an absolute joy to be had in immersing yourself in drone music like this, with it all just forming these rather dense blankets of sound waves that are just always washing over you. And all I really want to do is just close my eyes, drift off, and get carried along by the growing drones of the composition itself. It's something that, just captures me when I experience music like this, and I can't help but find it so enjoyable. Like, there's something so wholly alien about the whole thing, so otherworldly. But its occurrence as music, it does anchor it to our world, perhaps. But I do find myself so stunned and hypnotized, as I end up drifting off to it. And I think it's because it's such a long composition. It's one that takes such a time to progress towards its very end, and it seems to start almost as an abstraction of a myriad of notes, each and every one falling into the traps of those looping effects, slowly clambering over one another, and obscuring the oldest instances of sound into silence after such long stretches of time. It's just always slowly shifting and morphing into a different landscape, born from that initial image, just a sort of reinterpretation of it all the more it all progresses. But it's oddly delightful too. And I love how any occurrence of a note, it just suddenly becomes a very character for the scene, as it begins that process of looping and repeating that has occurred to every single note that has preceded it. And it makes it very delightful when certain textures introduce themselves, as they become very easily comfortable in the mix, just forming these lovely passages of sound navigation. It does, to be fair, navigate moments of absolute strangeness at times. There's something a little bit more peculiar when, he just opts for very odd notes. But even when you do get the most oddest tones, it still just feels very fascinating to experience it all. Especially as well towards the very end of the composition, we actually get very unexpected moments of actual guitar tones, it feels, at least in the context of what we've been hearing thus far on this very track. Following all these very dense, thick layers of drones, the ending seems to opt for these sort of clambering little clean guitar tones. And it emanates over the surface of those drones that do then quickly become caught in those looping effects as well, but it adds a bit of character to the incredibly strange nature of the composition itself. A very cool way to end this track, and it just results in something arguably oddly minimalist perhaps, weird but very cool in its own right, I would argue. Right, so moving on to the second track, we get Idiot's House. So this is such a bizarre track. This is the one I really remember the most out of it, but experiencing it for this review, I have no memory of that it occurred just like this. So this one opens up with some plugging in, and a sudden loud single occurrence of an electric guitar chord. One that begins to resonate before becoming caught in those delay effects, bouncing in place before morphing into this unusual vibrating frequency of drone. It becomes a longer instance of pure resonance, a vibration of that singular note that stretches further and further and further before being accompanied by additional layers of similarly occurring drones as a result of these constantly echoing effects that emanate outwards. It, for me, is so hypnotizing when it starts, as it feels, it slowly seems to lose more and more details of itself as it falls further and further into pure frequency itself, vibrating so wildly before turning into another faint occurrence that becomes a new focal point as your mind just starts to navigate from what it thinks it's hearing to what it isn't hearing and back and forth. It becomes such a weird thing as it just echoes and boop, 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 boop into place. To me, it kind of feels like the zooming of the Mandelbrot set, which has been used a lot in this video, of course, hasn't it? That constantly deeper and deeper image that slowly becomes smaller and smaller, and yet the detail of it is still the same as it ever was, no matter how far down you go. For some reason, it's an odd thing I've always appreciated. And it's also something I've always loved about drone music, the way that it can occur almost like a Mandelbrot zoom in audio form. If that makes any sense to you, of course. But for me, the way this track just slowly descends, it just feels very much like one to me, an ever-deepening descent further and further into the recesses of that singular frequency that is occurring constantly around us. It's hard to explain, but I just think it's so weirdly cool. And it might be a bit of a dumb comparison, who knows, but it's just what came to mind when sitting down to write up my thoughts about it, so I thought it'd be a good time to bring it up. But the way this track just constantly goes on and on, it feels like it's constantly straddling the line between rather intense drones and these constantly oscillating notes, just kind of precariously balanced against each other in this incredibly long-form composition. And I don't know why, but I've always thought it to be a really neat thing about this album. A track that just seems to slap you across the face as it occurs, and just gives you a deluge of feedback and drones rising in your ears, constantly going further and further. And once again, when you think about it, it's kind of oddly minimalist. Like, we have a sense of nothingness, perhaps, of actually very little actually happening here. But the kind of density and overloading nature of how it all occurs, it makes it very exciting to listen to. A captivating push down the Mandelbrot as you become completely hypnotized by the entire experience. Goodness, this is so difficult to comprehend, I find. I think, once again, because of its incredibly long runtime, it just becomes almost impossible to witness the full scope of it all at once. And much like the preceding track, it's just that sense of stupor that comes from listening to drone music. Very hard to properly articulate, but that's just the way it is sometimes. It just is a hard thing to kind of try to explain. I just know that listening to drone music is something I think is really neat, and it's always interesting, if you experience whenever you do so. I find. Now, when I was writing my thoughts about this, and listening to the sound of this album as well, or writing everything, I was very oddly enough reminded of a comment from long-time channel supporter T. Mamone, who mentioned something in our video for Angelo Vincent Jr. Now, normally I don't try to make reference to individual comments on this show, but when hearing this track, I was reminded very much of what they said for our video on Angelo Vincent Jr., which is an incredibly old episode of Weird Music. They mentioned that listening to the second track of that album caused them to have a sensation of being lifted out of their entire body. And I think that's what was happening for me here when I was writing about this song for this review. It's the same thing of you kind of just going whoosh with the music itself, just right out of place and time as you're just enveloped by drone music. And then their further comment, just to go back to what else they were saying, they mentioned in a bit more detail of the body being receptive to certain tones, which is what they were experiencing when listening to Angelo Vincent Jr. I think perhaps this is what draws the vast majority of people to drone music itself, right? We all respond to different things in our life. and certain albums will scratch that itch when we personally experience it. And for me, it occurs when listening to the likes of this for some reason. The way that the particulars of this drone sounds, it just seems to resonate something within me. You know, this almost navigation of effects into an infinite context, perhaps. The density of elongated drones that are always occurring. I just find my body just goes whoosh whenever I hear it. I think it's a very cool thing personally, and I think it's a very neat thing that comes to certain albums. Like, this is the kind of thing that I love, and the kind of thing that I experience when with the likes of Phil Newblock's Nothing to Look At, Just a Record, or the Gregory Gage's Unfriendly. These albums, the particulars of those tones and the way they sound just seem to resonate perfectly within me for some reason. And everybody probably has these things, right? We all, the way our bodies are, just seem to resonate with particular drones and particular sounds, right? The way they occur, and that's probably why we like drone music, right? For me, I just like how those albums sound and how this one sounds, because I just seem to connect to it on that weird level that T. Mamone so wonderfully explained. I think some people will get this. Maybe not, who knows? It's a very difficult thing to try and describe. But I think it's because it's a very personal thing that is individual to every single person that listens to drone music, right? People respond to different tones and different levels of resonance. And it's a long spectrum, and wherever you lay upon it is what you respond to. And for some reason, this lands there for me. So, weird album, right? I do think it's fascinating though how both tracks on this distinctly drone music, and yet both drone albums, or both drone tracks actually, for very different reasons it feels. Like, the first track feels like such an abstraction to drone itself, you know, this esoteric assortment of notes descending like synth waves, contrasted, you know, with a second track that kind of just whacks you over and over and over and just sends you down the rabbit hole of infinitesimal. It's weird because as I've said, I've had this album for a very long time in my collection, but I never really dug that deep into what I was hearing when experiencing it before. I kind of remember just always letting the drones just take over, just do their thing. But in context for this show, as oddly unremarkable as it is on a bunch of levels, like drone music so often is, it has been really fascinating to me to dive into it for this very video. Like, the one thing I vaguely remember from those first few instances when I had first heard it was that the second track was my favourite of the two, the one that stood out to me. And why that is? I don't know. It's oddly chaotic on so many levels, but maybe that's why I find it more fascinating, you know? And it's interesting. Two tracks that are so tonally different to each other. You know, they feel worlds apart from each other, you know, in surprising, unexpected ways. But almost like two contrasting forms of drone music. Both oddly minimalist, but one that feels much more intense. It's odd. I don't know if these, purposely contrasting these two things on purpose, or if it's just the result of whatever the hell was going on here. But it's definitely cool in my books, and I'm really glad to have found the time to discuss it on the show, because I just think it's a very cool little album. It's part of just a few random drone albums that I've purchased over the years, and something that I thought might have just been interesting to review. Like I said, I had kind of just forgotten about the actual way this album sounds, so it was really nice returning to it and kind of hearing it with a fresh new perspective for this video. And it's definitely resulted in one of the weirder episodes, but that's fine. There's an absurd number of albums I want to try discussing this show, and finding the time to sit down with each and every one, a little bit tricky these days. But, eventually we do find the time for another mind-melting drone excursion, right? And I'm glad for that. We're no closer to knowing who this dude is, right? There's just this random guy who in the 90s made some drone music on his guitar. And it's it doesn't even sound like proper drone music, but it also does at the same time. Why? Who knows? But for some reason, I grabbed a copy of it, and I really like it as a result. And so yeah, I think with that, we will be coming to the end of our episode of Weird Music. Set by Exit. What more can I say? Not a lot, really, is it? Still no idea who they are, still not sure about a lot of things, but this album is, as mentioned, one that I just found through searching Discogs Marketplace many years ago. Like, it was interesting because along that journey, found this one, gave it a spin, thought it was pretty cool, put it away in my collection, and then I thought, I wonder what it sounds like nowadays. And now we get to have this weird review about it. How pretentious. But I thought it'd be interesting to give it a whirl and see what it was like, and I seem to vaguely remember actually why I wanted to keep this one in my collection. Like, such a weird and peculiar instance of drone music, right? But I think it sounds fantastic for some reason. Like, it really piqued my curiosity when I sat down to listen to it. So, another one for the drone playlist, right? Like, I do think it's fun reviewing these weird drone albums, so I'll see if we find more time for them in future, but I don't know how popular they'll be, but to be fair, I don't really care about the popularity of things. I just want to explore anything. So yeah, don't know what you make of this one, but if you watch up to this point, then let me know in the comments what your favourite drone albums are. You know, that just transport you and lift your body up whenever you hear them, right? But now though, I wish you all the best. Hope you take care, and bye bye for now. Bye bye.